Look! Dusk dreams of a mate, he jeered, pointing at the silver and shadow mark she'd borne since birth. What fool would claim an outcast marked by a child's scrawl? More laughter. Evangeline flinched, pulling her sleeve down. But the laughter died, choked in their throats as a shadow fell over the square. He'd come not on a horse, but on his own 2 feet, a giant of a man clad in black fur. The Alpha King. His eyes, not human, but pure lupin gold, scanned the crowd, and everyone froze. His gaze landed on her hidden wrist, and he began to walk. The village of Greyfell huddled in a crease of the mountains, a place of sharp pines and sharper hunger. Snow clung to the roofs, a persistent biting cold that leached the warmth from everything. Evangeline Dusk knew the cold intimately. It lived in her bones, a constant companion, much like the strange tattoo on the inside of her left wrist. It was a swirl of silver, so pale it was almost invisible in most light, interwoven with a thread of pure shadow. It looked less like ink and more like a scar left by moonlight. She'd had it for as long as she could remember, found as a babe in the snows, a basket her only cradle, and this mark her only dowry. It had branded her. Outcast. Unwanted. Strange. Today, the cold was secondary to the fear. The Tithe Day market was a charade of prosperity. Villagers displayed their meager bounties, smoked fish, gnarled root vegetables, poorly tanned rabbit pelts, and rough-spun wool. These were offerings, tribute to the rulers of the high peaks, the wolf-shifters of Boreal Peak. The Alpha, their king, was a figure of myth, a creature of shadow and snow who demanded allegiance. Usually he sent only his collectors, grim men in gray cloaks. But the whispers this year were different. The king himself might come. Evangeline had nothing to offer. She huddled near the weak flame of the central fire pit, trying to sell 3 small charms of woven grass and dried berries. They were meant to ward off frostbite. No one was buying. "Get out of the way, Dusk," sneered Alara, the baker's daughter. Alara was flushed with warmth and bread, her cloak thick. "Your bad luck will sour the tribute." Evangeline shuffled back, pulling her threadbare cloak tighter. She hated this. The fear of the villagers was a tangible thing, a metallic taste in the air. But beneath it was their disdain for her. She was the changeling, the girl found in the woods, the one who didn't quite belong to the human world. "Look at that," a young smith's apprentice, Kyle, nudged his friend. Evangeline had been rubbing her wrist for warmth, and the ragged edge of her sleeve had slipped, revealing the mark. Kyle, emboldened by the nervous energy of the day, strode over. "What's that, Evie?" "A lover's promise," he sneered, grabbing her arm. She ripped it away, but not before he'd gotten a good look. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. "It's a joke," Kyle laughed, turning to the crowd. "Dusk thinks she's special. Got a little swirl to pretty herself up." This was the moment from the hook. The merchant's son joined in. "Look, Dusk dreams of a mate. What fool would claim an outcast marked by a child's scrawl?" The laughter was brittle, a way to break the tension of the Tithe Day. They laughed at her because she was safe to laugh at. She was the lowest, the scapegoat. Evangeline's face burned, hotter than the fire. She tucked her hand into the opposing sleeve, her nails biting into her own palm. She locked her jaw, refusing to give them tears. She stared into the fire, a single cold prayer echoing in her mind. Anywhere but here. A horn blew, not the familiar blast of the village watch, but a deep resonant sound that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. It shivered through the soles of their boots. The laughter died. It didn't just fade, it was stolen. Every villager, every merchant, every jeering apprentice froze. The air, already cold, plummeted. A presence descended on the square, a weight of authority so profound it pressed the breath from their lungs. They parted, a silent, terrified wave. He was not a myth. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders a bulwark against the wind. He wore no crown, no jewels. His station was announced by the thick midnight black wolf fur pelt that draped him, and by the 2 massive gray-furred wolves that flanked him, their yellow eyes glowing. Alpha King Xander Nightborn. His face was harsh, carved from the same mountain stone as his fortress. Dark hair was pulled back from a face that had seen 1,000 winters. He walked with a predator's grace, his gaze sweeping over the pathetic offerings. His disdain was a physical blow. He stopped, his head tilting, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. Evangeline hadn't moved. She was trapped, a rabbit in the shadow of an eagle. She dared not even breathe. His gaze snapped from the paltry tables to the crowd. It passed over the baker, the smith, the merchant, and then it found her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her left arm, the one she had tucked away. It was as if her cloak were glass, her sleeve smoke. He knew. He moved. The crowd shuffled back, gasping. He didn't push them. They simply dissolved from his path. He stopped 3 feet from her. The heat from his body washed over her, a furnace against the ice of the day. He was close enough for her to smell the pine, the ozone of the high snows, and something else, something wild and primal. The gold of his eyes was terrifying. They weren't just the color of lupin eyes. They were the eyes of a wolf, pupils and all. He stared at her hidden arm. Kyle, the apprentice, suddenly found his courage, mistaking the king's focus for confusion. "My king," he stammered, bowing low. She is nothing, an outcast. She has a mark, a foolish thing." Xander did not look at Kyle. His gaze remained locked on Evangeline. The silence stretched, thin and agonizing. The entire village held its breath. Slowly, as if in a trance, Evangeline felt her arm move. It was not her own will. It was his. She unwound her hand from her sleeve. The world narrowed to the space between them. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't blink. She held her wrist out. The silver and shadow mark pulsed just once with a faint cool light, as if greeting an old friend. A collective gasp. Kyle stumbled back, his face white with terror. Xander Nightborn's harsh face transformed. The disdain, the boredom, the cold authority, it all fractured, replaced by something Evangeline couldn't name. A violent, possessive shock. It was recognition. It was disbelief. It was raw, terrible need. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing the skin just below the mark. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. He never looked away from her, and in the frozen silence, he spoke. His voice was a low growl that vibrated in her chest. "She is mine." The words hung in the frozen air. Absolute. She is mine. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, a claim laid with the weight of a mountain. The villagers, who moments before had been mocking her, were now statues of dread. Their faces, pale and slack, shifted from Evangeline to the Alpha King, their eyes wide with a terror that was entirely new. They had feared the king's collectors. They were petrified by the king himself. But this was something else. This was the stuff of grim legends. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage too small. She couldn't breathe. Her gaze was trapped by his. Those golden, inhuman eyes held her, and she saw the predator in them, the wolf beneath the skin, assessing, claiming, owning. Xander Nightborn looked at the villagers, his lip curling just slightly in a snarl that needed no translation. "You laughed at her." It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. Kyle, the apprentice, made a strangled sound and fell to his knees, his forehead pressing into the dirty snow. "My king. Alpha, we didn't know. 1,000 pardons." Silence. The word was not loud, but it cracked like a whip. Kyle flinched as if struck. Xander's attention returned to Evangeline. He was so close. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He blocked the sun, the village, the world. There was only this giant of a man and the scent of pine and cold fur. He held his gloved hand out to her. It was not a request. It was a command. She looked at that hand. It was large enough to crush her skull. Anywhere but here, she had prayed. The gods had a cruel sense of humor. Her limbs were water, her mind numb. To refuse was death. To accept, what was acceptance? She was a mouse being offered a paw by a wolf. The choice was an illusion. Her hand, chapped and trembling, rose. She placed it in his. His grip was not crushing. It was firm, impossibly warm, swallowing her hand whole. The moment her skin touched his glove, the mark on her wrist burned, not with fire, but with a sudden aching cold, a feeling of rightness that terrified her more than his gaze. He tugged gently. She stumbled forward, her knees weak. "My cloak," he ordered, not to her, but to the air. One of his guards, a tall man with a face like a hawk, stepped forward instantly, pulling the thick midnight black fur from his king's shoulders. Xander took it, and in one fluid motion wrapped it around Evangeline. It was impossibly heavy, laden with the scent of him, and so warm it was almost scalding. The fur tickled her chin. She was instantly enveloped, lost in the scent and the darkness of it. The jeers of the crowd felt a lifetime away. She was marked by his scent now, branded just as surely as by the tattoo. "We leave," Xander said. He did not release her hand. He simply turned, towing her with him. The two massive wolves fell in step behind them, their claws clicking on the iced-over stones. Their low growls were a clear warning to anyone who might think of following. "My king!" It was the village elder, his voice cracking with desperation. The tribute! We have—" Xander paused but did not turn. "Your tribute is accepted," he growled. He gestured to Evangeline, still holding her hand. "I have taken what is owed." He was taking her as the tithe. The implication hung in the air, devastating. She wasn't a person he wanted. She was a thing he was collecting, a curiosity, a price. The brief, terrifying warmth of the cloak turned to ash. They walked through the parting crowd. No one met her eyes. Alara, the baker's daughter, was pressed against the wall of a cottage, her face as white as her flower. Kyle was still on his knees, shaking. She was Evangeline Dusk, the outcast. And now she was the Alpha King's property. At the edge of the square, a dozen more guards stood waiting, all clad in dark leathers and gray cloaks, their faces grim. They were mounted on massive horses, built for the mountain trails. A smaller, sturdy mare, black as shadow, was brought forward for her. Xander lifted her. He didn't ask. He didn't wait. One hand spanned her waist, and she was airborne, settled onto the saddle before she could even gasp. The strength in him was effortless, absolute. He mounted his own stallion, a war horse that dwarfed her mare, in a single fluid movement. He kept his horse beside hers, his knee almost touching hers. He still had not let go of her hand. He held her captive, tethered to him like a hawk to a falconer's glove. "Ride," he commanded. The company moved. They left the village square without a backward glance. Evangeline looked back once. She saw the small, huddled figures of the villagers, staring at the space where the king had been, at the empty spot by the fire where she had sat. No one waved. No one called her name. She had been erased. They rode into the trees, the towering pines swallowing them whole. The snow deepened. The only sounds were the crunch of the hooves, the jingle of harness, and the low huff of the wolves loping beside them. She was cold, despite the fur. She was terrified, despite the numbness. She looked at the man beside her. He was staring straight ahead, his profile rigid, his jaw set. He was the king of the shifters, a man who was more beast than human, bound by laws she could not fathom, and he was holding her hand. She tried once to pull it free. A small testing tug. His grip tightened instantly. His head turned. His golden eyes met hers. He said nothing, but his gaze did. It was a promise. "You are not leaving. You are not escaping. You are mine." The world she knew was gone. She was being taken into the heart of the winter, to the fortress of the Alpha King, and she had no idea if she was his guest, his prisoner, or his sacrifice. As the path steepened and the wind began to howl, she saw him in the shadow of the hall, watching, not as a king, but as a wolf. The journey was a blur of white. The snow fell thicker as they climbed, a silent, suffocating curtain that erased the world. Evangeline's mare was sure-footed, but she held the saddle horn with her free hand, her knuckles white. The other hand was still possessed by the king. He had not released her. He rode in silence, a formidable shadow beside her, his presence a tangible weight. The path became a narrow, winding track cut into the mountainside. The wind screamed, a living thing. Evangeline huddled deeper into the massive fur cloak, her face buried in the scent of pine and wildness. She was numb, her fear a cold, hard stone in her stomach. After what felt like days, the fortress emerged from the swirling snow. It was not a castle, it was a wound in the mountain. Boreal Peak was a jagged shard of black rock that stabbed the sky, and the fortress was built into it, a collection of grim towers and stone walls that seemed to grow from the precipice. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. The great gates, made of iron-banded timber, swung open with a groan. They rode into a vast, torchlit courtyard. The air here was warmer, shielded from the wind. Shifters in leather armor moved with purpose, stopping to bow low as the king passed. Their eyes, all tinged with that same lupin gold, slid to Evangeline. She saw the curiosity, the suspicion, the shock. Xander finally released her hand. The loss of warmth was immediate, her skin aching. He dismounted, and before she could move, he was at her side, his hands at her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. Her feet touched the stone, and her legs buckled. He caught her, one arm locking around her waist, holding her against him. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She was pressed against a wall of muscle and leather. Her heart leaped into her throat. She could feel the steady, slow thump of his heart. It was too slow, not entirely human. She pushed against his chest, and he let her go, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second. "Alice," he called. A woman emerged from a stone archway. She was tall, silver-haired, and possessed a quiet authority that rivaled the king's. Her eyes were a pale, icy blue, but they held no malice, only a deep, unnerving wisdom. She was draped in fine wools of gray and white. "My king," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She bowed. "She is cold," Xander said. He seemed, for the first time, uncertain. He looked at Evangeline, at her chapped hands and the terror in her eyes. "See to her." Alice's gaze fell upon Evangeline. It was not a kind look, nor was it cruel. It was an assessment. She saw the threadbare dress, the cheap boots, the king's fur draped over her. Then, her eyes fixed on Evangeline's left wrist. "So," Alice breathed, the single word steeped in meaning. "It is true." "See to her," Xander repeated, his voice harder. He turned without another word and strode into the keep, his two wolves at his heels. Evangeline was left with the silver-haired woman. "Come, child," Alice said, her tone neutral. "You are not in the village square anymore." She led Evangeline deep into the fortress. It was a labyrinth of stone, warmed by massive fire pits and smelling of smoke and roasted meat. The walls were hung with tapestries of ancient hunts, of massive wolves howling at a broken moon. It was a place of primal power. Alice brought her to a room. It was not a cell. It was a large, well-appointed chamber with a roaring fireplace and a bed piled high with furs. A copper tub, already steaming, sat in an alcove. "You will bathe. You will wear these." Alice pointed to a simple but warm dress of deep blue wool laid out on the bed. "Then you will eat. Someone will fetch you." "Where am I?" Evangeline's voice was a croak. "You are in Boreal Peak, the King's Keep," Alice replied, as if that explained everything. Why am I here?" Alice paused at the door, her hand on the iron latch. She looked Evangeline over, her gaze lingering on the wrist. "You are here because he brought you. The Alpha King is bound by laws older than these stones, and you, child, you are bound by something older still." The mark?" Evangeline whispered, holding her arm. "It is the Anamkara," Alice said, her voice dropping. "The mark of the soul's friend. We thought it a myth, a children's story to hope for a cure." "A cure for what?" But Alice shook her head. "Bathe. He will not be kept waiting." She left, the heavy door closing with a soft thud. There was no lock. Evangeline was sure, but she was just as sure she was a prisoner. She bathed. The hot water stung her cold skin, but it was a relief. She scrubbed the grime of the village from her body, watching the water turn gray. As she washed, her tattoo seemed to darken, the silver lines brighter against her clean skin. Anam Cara. She dressed in the clothes. They were soft, warm, and fit perfectly. She felt different. Not like Evangeline Dusk, the outcast, but like someone else. A stranger in a cage. A young, silent girl came and led her to a smaller hall. It was not the great hall, but a private dining chamber. A fire roared. A table was set for two. Xander was already there. He had shed his armor and the black pelt. He wore a simple tunic of dark gray, his powerful forearms bare. He was standing by the fire, staring into the flames. He looked less like a king and more like a storm trapped in the shape of a man. He heard her enter and turned. His golden eyes swept over her, taking in the clean skin, the warm dress. The intensity of his gaze made her want to retreat, to cover herself. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the table. She sat, her back rigid. The food was rich: stew, dark bread, roasted meat. She hadn't seen such a meal in her life. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she couldn't lift the spoon. He sat opposite her. He did not eat. He just watched. The silence was a physical thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "Why am I here?" she asked again, her voice stronger this time. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "That mark on your wrist," he said, his voice a low growl. "Where did you get it?" I've always had it. I was found with it." "Found where?" "In the snow, near Greyfell, 20 winters ago." His eyes closed for a moment. A muscle in his jaw clenched. 20 years, he murmured. "The curse has held for 20 years. "The curse?" He looked at her, his gaze raw. "My people we are. Changing, weakening. The bond with our other half." He gestured to his own chest. "The wolf, it is frayed. Shifting is agony. Our lands are barren. The winter does not recede. The seers said it was a curse of the blood, that the land starves because the Alpha line is broken." Evangeline stared. "What does this have to do with me?" "The Anam Cara," he said, his voice rough. "The prophecy. It states that only the soul's friend, the one bearing the moonlight mark, can heal the bloodline, can heal the Alpha, can heal the land." Her blood ran cold. Heal. How? Xander looked away from her, into the fire. The flames reflected in his golden eyes, making them burn. He looked tormented. "The prophecy is not gentle. It is a thing of blood and sacrifice." Evangeline's hand flew to her wrist, covering the mark. He wasn't looking at her as a person. He was looking at her as a cure, a tool, an offering. "You brought me here to use me," she whispered, horror dawning. He said nothing. His silence was the answer. She rose from the table, her chair scraping on the stone. "I am not a sacrifice. You are what the law demands," he snarled, rising to his feet, his own control snapping. He was across the room in 2 strides, looming over her. The air crackled with his power. "Do you think I wanted this? To find the one hope for my people in a girl from a village that despises her? You are the key. You have no choice." "I am not a key," she cried, defiant. "I am a person." "You are here," he growled, backing her against the cold stone wall. He braced his hands on either side of her head, trapping her. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his breath, hot on her skin. "You are here, and you will not leave." She saw him in the shadow of the hall, watching, not as a king, but as a wolf, and she, trapped against the stone, was the prey. Chapter 4. The Bloom of Winter. The days that followed were a cold, beautiful prison. Evangeline was not locked in. She was free to wander the upper halls of Boreal Peak, but the fortress itself was an island in a sea of impassable snow. The guards at the gates were polite but obsidian firm. There was no escape. Alis, the silver-haired elder, became her reluctant keeper. She brought Evangeline books from the keep's library, histories of the shifter lines, tomes on ancient laws. "If you are to be here," Alice said, her voice dry, "you will not be ignorant." Evangeline read. She read about the first wolf, about the bond between the shifters and the land, and about the curse that had befallen them 2 decades prior. The fraying, they called it. The land grew cold, the wolves grew sick, and the bond that allowed them to shift became a thing of pain. The timing was unmistakable. It had begun the year she was born, the year she was found. She was the cause, and she was the cure. She saw Xander only at a distance. She would catch his scent, that sharp, wild smell of pine and ozone, and know he was near. She would see him across the courtyard, sparring with his guards, moving with a speed and power that was not human. Or she would see him in the great hall, holding counsel, his face a mask of iron as his court argued. They argued about her. She learned to listen. The stone walls carried whispers. The mark is real, but she is human, weak. She has no training. A common born. What if the prophecy is wrong? What if she is a poison? The king is hesitant. He watches her. The law is clear. Why does he wait? The law. The prophecy. Sacrifice. The words echoed in her mind. Xander had not approached her since that night in the dining hall. He was keeping his distance, but his gaze was a constant weight on her skin. She would look up from her book by the fire, and he would be there, standing in the shadow of an archway, his golden eyes fixed on her. The moment she met his gaze, he would be gone, melting back into the stone. He was a hunter, and he was stalking her. Or perhaps he was guarding her. She couldn't tell. The fear was beginning to curdle, changing into a strange, aching confusion. One afternoon, Alice took her to a place Evangeline had not yet seen. A vast glass-walled garden built on a high precipice. It was a solarium, a desperate attempt to hold back the endless winter. Inside it was humid and warm, but it was failing. The plants were withered, the trees skeletal. A few hardy, colorless mosses clung to the stones. "This was the heart garden," Alice said, her voice softer than Evangeline had ever heard it. "The land's life was tied to the queen's, and the queen, our last queen, Xander's mother, died the day the fraying began, the day you were born." Alice looked at Evangeline. "The king has not entered this place since he was a boy." Evangeline walked through the dead garden, her heart aching. She saw a single withered rose bush, its stems black and thorny. One dead brown bud clung to a branch. She reached out, her fingers tracing the dry petals. She thought of her own life, found in the snow, scorned in the village, a prisoner in the keep, a sacrifice in waiting. She felt a kinship with this dead, frozen thing. A single tear of pure, cold frustration slid down her cheek. It landed on the bud. "It's not fair," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind whistling outside the glass. She touched the bud again, her thumb brushing the tear away. She felt the mark on her wrist tingle. Not the burn of Xander's touch, but a gentle, humming warmth. A soft, silver light pulsed from her tattoo, traveling up her arm and into her fingertips. The brown petals shivered. A flush of impossible color, a deep velvety crimson, crept from the base of the bud. The petals unfurled. Slowly, miraculously, the dead rose bloomed. It was a perfect, deep red flower, vibrant and alive in the midst of the dead garden. It released a scent of summer, so potent it filled the glass house. Evangeline snatched her hand back, staring. "What?" "By the first wolf," Alice whispered from behind her. Her voice was shaking. The elder stepped forward, her icy blue eyes wide with terrified awe. She looked from the rose to Evangeline. "Life. You are life." Evangeline turned, her heart pounding. Xander was standing in the doorway. He must have been following them. He hadn't been watching from a distance this time. He was here. His black-clad form was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. He was staring at the crimson rose, his face pale beneath his winter tan. His golden eyes were wide, not with anger, but with a profound, earth-shattering shock. He'd seen it. The king had seen the impossible bloom. He lifted his gaze to hers. The mask of the Alpha, the iron control, was gone. She saw the man beneath, the man who was burdened, who was desperate, who was afraid. All this time, he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. We were wrong. My king? Alis said, trembling. Xander ignored her. He took a step toward Evangeline, his eyes never leaving hers. He wasn't stalking now. He was being drawn, a moth to a flame he had thought long extinguished. The prophecy, he said, his voice low. We read it as a sacrifice, a bloodletting, an end. He stopped, just out of reach. He looked at the flower, then back at her hand, the one with the tattoo. It never said death, he whispered, a terrible, dawning realization on his face. It said, a life for a life. We assumed. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. Not as a key, not as a cure, not as a sacrifice, but as Evangeline. It doesn't mean a life taken, he said, his voice cracking. It means a life given. He'd seen it. The king had seen the impossible bloom, and his face was a mask of terror. Because if she was life, and his laws had demanded her death, he had almost doomed them all. The miracle of the rose changed everything, and nothing. The fortress was rigid with ancient laws. The whispers in the court did not cease. They intensified. Xander was the Alpha King, but he was not a tyrant. He was the guardian of traditions that had kept his people alive for millennia. His word was law, but the law itself was above him. And the law, as it was written, was clear. Alis led Evangeline from the garden, her hand gentle on her arm for the first time. Xander remained behind, staring at the single crimson rose blooming in the dead garden, a sentinel of stone. That night, he came to her room. She was sitting by the fire, the book of laws open in her lap, her tattoo seeming to glow in the dim light. She heard the soft scrape of the door and looked up. He stood in the entryway, not as a king, but as a man. He had removed his heavy outer tunic, wearing only a simple linen shirt. He looked tired. The weight of his crown seemed to be pressing him into the earth. "May I?" he asked. His voice was quiet. She nodded, her heart skipping. He entered and closed the door, shutting the rest of the keep out. He didn't approach her, but went to the window, looking out at the endless swirling snow. The moonlight caught the silver in his dark hair. "Alis showed me the passages," he said, his back to her, "the ones we misinterpreted." "A life for a life," Evangeline whispered, reading from the page. "The Anam Kara shall offer her heart's light to the heart tree, and the land shall be renewed." "The heart tree," he murmured. "It's the oldest part of the fortress, the source. It's dying. It has been dormant for 20 years. He turned to face her. "We always believed to offer her heart's light meant her blood, her death, a sacrifice to water the roots. But the flower, he agreed, a small pained smile touching his lips. You didn't kill it. You healed it." He walked closer, crouching down by her chair so he was eye level with her. The predator was gone. This was something else. "Evangeline, your name. Who gave it to you?" "I don't know. It was on a ribbon in the basket." "Evangeline," he repeated. "It means bearer of good news, not bringer of death." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound weariness. "My entire life, I have been raised for this, to be the Alpha, to be strong, to make the hard choice. And for 20 years, I have known my one single purpose was to find the Anam Kara and kill her to save my people." His confession hung in the air, cold and terrible. "That," Evangeline said, her voice shaking, "is what you saw in the market. Why you claimed me. You were claiming your sacrifice." His golden gaze was filled with a self-loathing that stunned her. Yes, he said, that is what I saw. And now? Now, I see the bloom in the snow. He hesitated. Then, so slowly she could have stopped him, he reached for her hand. Not to claim, not to pull. He simply laid his large, warm hand over hers, his thumb brushing the tattoo. The jolt was still there, but this time it wasn't frightening. It was a connection, a current. The mark on her wrist pulsed with a gentle silver light, and his skin, where he touched her, seemed to glow with a faint answering gold. I can feel you, he breathed, his eyes wide. Your heartbeat, it's steady. She could feel his too, that slow, powerful, not quite human rhythm. The fraying, he said, his voice rough. The sickness in my people, it is a coldness, a loneliness. The wolf is distant. But when I touch you, he closed his eyes. The wolf is quiet. It's at peace. He was the alpha, the strongest of them all, and he was admitting a weakness she could barely comprehend. He was broken, and she, somehow, was the only thing that made him whole. But the court, she said, pulling her hand back. The light died. He looked bereft. Aeless. They all believe the old way. They all expect it. They are afraid, he said, standing. He began to pace the room, the caged wolf again. The fraying gets worse. We had 3 deaths this moon. Shifters who tried to change and couldn't change back. They were lost, frozen between. We are dying, Evangeline. Then tell them, she insisted, standing to face him. Show them the rose. Tell them there is another way. You think they will believe it? He scoffed, but the sound was bitter. They will say it's a trick, a glamour. They will say the human girl has bewitched the alpha to save her own skin. They will say I am weak, that I am putting a stray before my people. They will challenge me. And if I am challenged and I fall, the one who kills me will have you on the altar before sunrise. The stark, brutal politics of it silenced her. He was trapped. He was king, but he was a prisoner of his own court. What do we do? She asked, the word slipping out before she could stop it. His head snapped up. He looked at her, and the loneliness in his eyes was a canyon. The fact that she had aligned herself with him, it struck him silent. There is one way, he said, his voice barely audible. To prove it, but it is dangerous, not just for you, for me. What is it? Aelys spoke of the heart tree. It is in the crypt at the mountain's root. It is the place of the ritual. The law demands the offering be made on the blood moon. That is, 3 nights from now. You want to perform the ritual? But you said, I want to change the ritual, he countered, his eyes blazing. If you touch that tree, and it blooms as the rose did, the law will be fulfilled, the land will be healed, and you will be seen not as a sacrifice, but as a savior, as the true Anamkara. And if it doesn't work, she whispered, if the rose was a fluke, then we are both lost, he said grimly. They will tear us apart, me for my heresy and you for your failure. He looked at her, his face harsh. I will not order you to do this. I cannot. I broke the law the moment I saw you, and hesitated. The king I should be would have had your blood on the snow in that market. He would not have brought you here. He would not be in this room. He was giving her the choice he himself did not have. I will not be your victim, she said, her voice quiet but steel hard. But I will not be your people's either. I don't want anyone else to die. He looked at her, and his gaze softened so much it was like a physical touch. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was barely there. You are braver than my entire court, he murmured, braver than your king. He stepped back, the moment broken. I have to prepare. The council must be told that the ritual will proceed. They will expect a death. He paused at the door. Xander, she said. He stopped, his hand on the latch. I am afraid. He turned. The moonlight from the window caught his face. So am I, he breathed. He looked at her, his voice rough. The law says the mark is not a blessing. It is a sacrifice. I'm beginning to think it is, just not yours. The next 2 days were a storm of silent tension. Xander was gone, locked in council with his elders. Evangeline could feel the thrum of anger and argument through the fortress stones. The guards in the halls no longer looked at her with curiosity. They looked with a grim, cold certainty. They were preparing for a sacrifice. Alis was her only companion. The elder was torn. The king is walking a knife's edge, she told Evangeline, her hands twisting in her robes. He is Alpha, but the pack is the pack. If they smell weakness, they will turn. Is telling the truth weakness? Evangeline asked, staring into the fire. It is, when the lie is 1,000 years old, Alis said sadly. They need to believe in the blood sacrifice. It is simple. It is clean. This hope, this life-giving. It is complicated. It requires faith. And faith is in short supply, child. On the second day, Evangeline couldn't bear the stone walls. She needed air. The king's cloak, which had been left in her room, was a comfort. She wrapped it around herself and, bypassing the main halls, found a small postern gate that led to the battlements. The wind was brutal, but it was real. It tore the breath from her lungs and whipped her hair into a frenzy. She was high above the world, the snow-blasted peaks stretching out in every direction. She was a world away from Greyfell. A low growl startled her. One of Xander's wolves, the larger of the two, was there. The gray beast was lying by the stone merlin, his yellow eyes fixed on her. She froze. He did not rise. He did not snarl. He just watched. Then he let out a low woof and rested his massive head on his paws. She was the king's. And so, she was protected. A sound from the courtyard below drew her attention. Hooves on stone. A party of guards, a dozen of them, was riding out. They were heavily armed, and Xander was with them. He was in his black armor, the midnight pelt settled on his shoulders. He looked every inch the Alpha King. He mounted his war horse, and as if sensing her, his gaze snapped up. He found her, a small figure in his own cloak on the high wall. He held her gaze for a long, unreadable moment. Then he nodded, a sharp, quick gesture. Acknowledgement, a promise. He turned and led his men out of the gate. Alis appeared at her side, her face grim. A patrol, now? He did not tell the council. Where are they going? Evangeline asked, a cold dread creeping into her. There have been incidents, Alis admitted, her gaze on the disappearing riders. Shifters, lost to the fraying, they become feral. They attack our borders. He hunts his own people. It is his greatest shame. Evangeline watched until they were gone, swallowed by the pines. The wolf at her feet let out a low, mournful whine. The hours passed. The sun began to dip, painting the snows in shades of blood and violet. The wind grew teeth. Evangeline did not leave the wall. The wolf did not leave her side. A horn blew from the watchtower, a single, frantic blast. Danger. They are back, Alis said, her voice sharp with relief. But the relief died as the gate swung open. The party staggered in. They were not riding. They were walking or limping. 2 horses were missing. 1 man was being carried. And Xander. Xander was leaning heavily on his horse, his left side dark with a spreading stain. No, Evangeline breathed. She ran. She flew down the tower stairs, heedless of Alis calling her name. She burst into the courtyard just as Xander stumbled. His guards rushed to catch him. Alpha! It was the feral, he gasped, pushing them away. His face was pale, beaded with sweat despite the cold. Thoros. I knew him. He saw her. His golden eyes, glazed with pain, found her in the chaos. Evangeline, you should not. He collapsed. The courtyard exploded into motion. Get him inside! Alis, the healer's kit. Bar the gate. They carried him into the great hall, laying him on a table near the massive fire pit. The wolf was there in an instant, snarling at anyone who came too close, until Evangeline pushed through. The wolf went silent, nudging her hand. "Let me see," Alis commanded, tearing at Xander's armor straps. Evangeline was at his side. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. When Alis pulled the leather cuirass and the tunic away, they all recoiled. It was not a normal wound. 3 massive claw marks were raked across his ribs from his side to his chest. But the flesh was wrong. It was black, iced over. A dark, cold mist was rising from the wound. "Cursed," Alis whispered, horrified. "The ferrule, it was fully lost. This is not a wound we can heal. It is poison to the wolf." Xander groaned, his body arching in a spasm of agony, his hand, a fist, clenched on the table. "It's cold," he managed to say. His skin was turning gray. The fraying, the curse, it was consuming him, entering him through the wound. "No," Evangeline said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the panic. She looked at the wound, at the black ice spreading like frost on a window pane. She looked at Xander's face, contorted in an agony she couldn't stand to see. This was the man who had claimed her, who had terrified her, who had caged her, and who had looked at her with desperate hope. He was her partner, her king. She placed her hands on his chest, on the uninjured skin. It was frigid. "Child, what are you doing?" Alis cried. "You cannot." "He is cold," Evangeline said, her voice shaking. "But I am not." She closed her eyes. She didn't think. She felt. She remembered the rose. She remembered the tingle of his touch. She reached for that feeling, that hum of life inside her. She pushed it. The mark on her wrist blazed. It was not a gentle silver pulse. It was a flood of white gold light, so bright the guards cried out and shielded their eyes. It poured from her tattoo, up her arms, and into her hands. Where her palms touched him, his skin steamed. She pressed her hands directly onto the wound, onto the black frozen flesh. It was like plunging her hands into a frozen river, an agony of cold that shot up to her shoulders. She cried out, but she did not let go. Xander roared. It was not a man's sound. It was the howl of a wolf, primal and full of pain. His back arched off the table. The black ice cracked. The silver light from her hands poured into the wound, warring with the darkness. She could feel his heart stuttering, failing. "No," she thought, pouring everything she was into him. "You will not have him." The light flared, blindingly bright, and then vanished. Evangeline collapsed forward, her strength gone, falling across his chest. The hall was silent, save for her ragged breathing. "Evangeline," a voice whispered. She lifted her head. She was weak, dizzy. Xander was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The gold was bright, no longer hazed with pain. The gray pallor was gone from his skin. She looked down. Where her hands rested, the wound was gone. The flesh was new, pink and whole. The black ice had vanished. He was healed. He lifted his hand, his movements weak but steady. He touched her cheek. His skin was warm. "Anam Cara," he breathed, "soul's friend." She pressed her hands to the wound, and a silver light, the light of her tattoo, flared beneath her palms. The entire court, the guards, Alis, they had all seen it. The proof was undeniable. The proof changed the whispers into a roar. What Evangeline had done in the great hall was more powerful than any argument, more convincing than any bloom. She had not just healed the Alpha King, she had purged the curse's touch. She had done the impossible. She became a new thing, not the outcast, not the sacrifice, but the lumiere, the light-bringer. The court was split. The elders, led by Alis, were now fervent believers. "The law is fulfilled," Alis declared, her voice ringing with newfound faith. "The prophecy is a life for a life, and she gave him life." But others, the more militant, the more desperate, were not convinced. A burly, scarred shifter named Ulrich, Xander's chief rival, slammed his fist on the council table. "She healed a wound," he snarled. "She did not heal the land. She did not stop the fraying. The blood moon is tomorrow night. The law is the law. The heart tree starves. It demands blood, not parlor tricks. Xander, recovering with a speed that was itself miraculous, sat at the head of the table. He was quiet, his gaze fixed on Evangeline, who stood near the fire. She was no longer his prisoner. She was, in the eyes of all, his equal. "She healed me, Ulrich," Xander said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The curse frost. She banished it." "Then let her banish it from the land," Ulrich challenged, pointing at her. "Let her face the heart tree. If her light is so strong, the tree will accept it. And if it is not, it will take the blood that it is owed. Either way, the curse ends." It was a trap, and they all knew it. He was calling their bluff, forcing the ritual to proceed, but on his terms. "You would see her die," Xander growled, rising. "I would see my people live," Ulrich roared, rising to meet him. "Or have you forgotten them, my king? Have you been so bewitched by this human that you would doom us all for her?" The challenge hung in the air. Xander's hands clenched, his wolf pushing at his skin, his eyes flaring gold. "No," Evangeline said, her voice clear and carrying. Both men turned to her. The council went silent. "He is right," she said, stepping forward. The entire room stared at her. "The land is not healed. The fraying continues. I will go to the heart tree." "Evangeline, no," Xander said, his control breaking. "You don't know what you're—" "I do know," she said, meeting his gaze. She was no longer the terrified girl from the market. She was the woman who had faced death and won. "You were willing to risk this to prove I was the Lumiere. I am willing to risk it to be her. I will not be the cause of a war in your court. I will not be the reason your people call you weak. I will face the tree." Her courage stunned them all into silence. Ulrich looked at her, his suspicion warring with a new, grudging respect. Xander stared at her, his heart in his eyes. He saw her, not as a key, not as a savior, but as the woman she had become, strong, resolute. "You are the king," she whispered, for his ears only, though the whole room strained to hear. "But I am the sacrifice. The choice is mine." The next night, the blood moon rose. It was a grotesque weeping eye in the sky, staining the snows of Boreal Peak a sickly red. The fortress was silent, every torch lit. The entire population, every shifter, every human servant was gathered. They filed down into the mountain's root, into the crypts. The air grew ancient, smelling of dust and cold stone. At the center of a vast natural cavern was the heart tree. It was a truly massive primordial thing, or it had been. Now it was a skeletal, blackened husk. It looked like it had been struck by lightning. Its roots were buried deep in the rock, and its dead branches clawed at the cavern roof. It was utterly, terrifyingly dead. This was the source of the fraying. This was the heart of the land, and it had stopped beating. Ulrich and his contingent stood on one side. Alis and the new believers stood on the other. Xander, in his ceremonial black armor, stood before the tree. He looked like a god of winter, dark and formidable. He turned to the crowd. "The law will be honored," he said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "The Anam Kara is here. The offering will be made." A path cleared. Evangeline walked forward. She wore the simple blue dress, the king's cloak draped over her shoulders. She looked small against the massive tree, against the stone, against the weight of 1,000 years of law. She walked past Ulrich, her gaze steady. She walked past Alis, offering a small, trembling smile. She stopped in front of Xander. He looked at her, his face a mask of iron, but his eyes were in agony. He was the king. He had to let this happen. He was bound. "Evangeline," he murmured so low no one else could hear. I know," she whispered back. "We are in this together." She turned from him and faced the tree. It was cold. A palpable aura of death radiated from it. This was the source of the wound she had healed on Xander. It was 1,000 times more powerful. She took a deep breath. She thought of the rose. She thought of Xander's heartbeat beneath her hands. She reached out and placed her hand, the hand with the silver and shadow mark, on the blackened bark of the heart tree. The moment her skin touched the bark, the cavern changed. A wave of absolute soul-crushing despair washed over everyone. It was the tree's hunger, its agony. It was 20 years of death, of loneliness, of fraying. The torches in the room flickered, the flames turning blue. Several shifters cried out, clutching their heads. Evangeline screamed. It was not a jolt of power, it was a void. The tree was a vacuum, and it was pulling the life from her. The mark on her wrist blazed, not with light, but with shadow. The black lines of her tattoo deepened, spreading up her arm like frostbite. The tree was drinking her. It's killing her, Alice shrieked, horrified. The tree, it's too dead. It can't be healed. It can only take. Ulrich's face was a mask of grim triumph. The blood sacrifice. It demands the blood. Evangeline's knees buckled. Her vision was tunneling. She could feel her own heartbeat slowing, the warmth leaching from her body. The tree was draining her to water its roots, just as the old law had demanded. She was dying. Xander, she gasped, her hand still frozen to the bark. Xander watched, his body rigid, his face shattering. He saw her life fading. He saw the shadow creeping up her arm. He saw the triumph on Ulrich's face. He heard the cries of his people or her, the land or her, the law or her, a life for a life. No, the word was a growl, ripped from his throat. In 2 strides, he was at the tree. Xander, no, the ritual, Ulrich roared. Xander ignored him. He grabbed Evangeline's arm, the one not on the tree. He pulled her, but she was stuck fast. It won't. Let go, she whispered, her eyes fluttering. He looked at her hand, at the black shadow coiling around it, and he made his choice. He was the king. He was the land. He was the Alpha. His life was the land's life. You want a sacrifice? He roared, not at Ulrich, but at the tree. You want the Alpha's blood? Then take it. He drew a dagger from his belt. In one swift, brutal motion, he sliced his own palm open. Blood, dark and royal, welled instantly. Xander! Alice screamed. Before anyone could stop him, he slammed his bleeding hand against the tree, directly on top of Evangeline's. He covered her hand with his. His blood, the Alpha's blood, flowed over her skin, over the tattoo. The effect was instantaneous, and it was violent. The tree shuddered. The cavern groaned as the ground shook. The black shadow on Evangeline's arm recoiled from his blood as if struck. The silver in her tattoo, fed by his power, ignited. A light, a pure white gold light, erupted from where their hands were joined. It was not the cold light of the moon. It was the warmth of a sunrise. It blasted the despair from the room, replacing it with a wave of raw, intoxicating life. The light shot from their hands into the tree. It raced up the trunk into the dead branches. The black bark cracked, splitting apart, and from within the dead wood, new wood emerged, pale and glowing. The light saturated the cavern. Every shifter present cried out, but not in pain, in relief. They fell to their knees as a warm, tingling energy washed through them. The fraying, the cold, lonely sickness. It was gone. The bond with their wolves was solid, whole and warm for the first time in 20 years. Evangeline felt the void recede. The tree was no longer drinking from her. It was drinking with her. She and Xander were a conduit, their 2 lives, their 2 souls, human and Alpha, light and blood, pouring into the heart of the mountain. His blood, her light. The tree's branches, now glowing, burst into leaf. Not green leaves, but leaves of soft silver light. They unfurled, illuminating the cavern with a gentle, warm glow. The curse was broken. Evangeline collapsed, but Xander caught her. He pulled her away from the tree, his hand still covering hers. He was breathing heavily, his face pale from the blood loss, but his eyes, his golden eyes fixed on her, were blazing with adoration. The cavern was silent. Every eye was on the living, glowing heart tree. and on the king, who held the human girl in his arms as if she were his own heart. Ulrich stared, his weapon dropped from his hand. He looked at his own arms, at the new, steady warmth he felt. He looked at his king, who had defied the law and saved them all. He dropped to one knee. "Alpha," he breathed. One by one, the entire court, the entire pack, knelt, not in fear, not in tradition, but in true, profound allegiance. Xander looked down at Evangeline. She was exhausted, but smiling. Her tattoo was no longer silver and shadow. It was now pure, pale silver, shining faintly on her skin. "The magic didn't just take," he whispered, his voice rough. "It gave." He bent his head, and in front of his court, his kingdom, and the ancient living heart tree, the Alpha King kissed his Anam Cara. And in the blinding light, Xander Nightborn fell, right into the arms of his new, healed world. Epilogue. The longest thaw. The first sign was the sound. It was a week after the blood moon. Evangeline stood on the battlements of Boreal Peak, the king's cloak still draped over her shoulders. But it was no longer a borrowed thing. It was a gift. The sound was a drip, then another. Drip, drip, crack. She looked over the wall. The massive icicles that had hung from the fortress eaves for 20 years were, one by one, shattering on the stones below. The snows were melting. She heard his step behind her. She didn't need to turn. She knew his footfall, his scent, his heartbeat. She leaned back and his arms came around her, pulling her against his chest. Xander Nightborn rested his chin on her head, his own cloak settling around them both. "It's loud," he murmured, his voice a warm rumble against her ear. "It's wonderful," she replied, smiling. They looked out over the valley. The world was no longer a stark, flat white. Patches of dark, rich earth were appearing on the slopes. Far below, the river, which had been a ribbon of ice, was now a roaring, crashing torrent of freed water. The air smelled not of frost, but of damp earth and moss. It was the scent of spring. "The fraying is gone," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder he still hadn't gotten used to. "The elders, they can shift without pain. The pups, they're playing." "And Ulrich?" she asked. "Is my most loyal shield," Xander said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "He follows you around like one of my wolves, you know. He's terrified you'll trip on the stairs." Evangeline laughed, a sound that was still new to her. "Ayla says the heart tree has fruited." "It has," Xander said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glowing silver seed. "The first in a generation." He didn't give it to her. He held it in his own palm, the one that bore a new scar, a silver line that matched her own tattoo. He covered her hand with his, and together they held the seed. A promise. They were not king and sacrifice. They were not alpha and human. They were just Xander and Evangeline, the two halves of a whole. He turned her in his arms. His golden lupin eyes were soft. The predator was still there, but he was hers. "They laughed at you," he murmured, his thumb tracing the silver mark on her wrist. "They did," she whispered, her fear a distant memory, a story from another life. "They will never laugh again." He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of pine and spring and forever. Below them, the world was waking up. The winter was over. The curse was broken. The crown had been defied, and in its place, a bond of love and magic had healed the land. It was the longest, hardest thaw, and it had finally begun. This story follows Evangeline's journey from a scorned outcast to the prophesied lumiere of a broken people. The narrative is driven not by grand battles, but by the cinematic internal struggle between fear and trust, and the tension between ancient brutal laws and the dawning of a new, gentler truth. The sensory details of the endless winter, the biting snow, the scent of pine, the oppressive cold of the stone, serve as a mirror for the fraying, the emotional and magical coldness infecting the shifters. Xander's transformation from a grim alpha bound by duty to a man willing to defy his crown for love is the story's emotional core. Their bond, forged in fear, solidified in survival, and proven in sacrifice, becomes the catalyst that heals not just the king, but the land itself. The conclusion, a quiet scene of the coming spring, delivers on the promise of freedom and a love that was fated, yet chosen.